Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing? Okay? This gives me a lot of opportunity and fun to have with you. And if anyone who knows me, I like to walk around a lot. What we're going to be doing here is talking about some perspectives. One thing is to reinforce what you just heard from Barry. And then the second thing is I'm going to be talking about, from a prosthodontic perspective, how we go about understanding the attributes of the new EV system. With this, what I'm going to be talking about is this continuous process of evolution. Now, I do have to add at this point, Darwin, as much as he sailed around the world with a beagle, he was an academic, and he worked very hard at trying to be a good academic and understanding the science. And unfortunately, if you didn't know the story, it took him 25 years to actually write the book that he's best known for. And that was only because another investigator was going to scoop him and get a publication out first. So by disclaimer, even Darwin had some problems in terms of getting that publish or perish aspect out there. And it is absolutely critical to understand the documentation that goes into the evolution of a system. So when we talk about this, the challenges here is to actually enhance the perception. I'm going to talk about this in depth here, about this concept of what we mean by the perception of primary stability, the expanded range of options, robustness of each implant actually gaining strength on its own, as well as the implant abutment connection. You've already heard earlier about the CAD/CAM solutions, and I'm going to come back with my argument that when I first heard about this system, the thing that got me most excited was the moment they said the Atlantis fits one way. And I'm thinking, all those hours of trying to figure out how abutments fit or not, now it was a very straightforward, simplified action for any student, any young practitioner, or any established practitioner, because we want simplified restorative solutions. So when we think about this, we have a continuum of care. We have that which is desired, and we have then the solutions on the other end of possible outcomes. One, as we know, is we want to try to reduce time in care, perhaps reducing the number of implants, using individual implant that's more robust, sometimes angling or tilting the implants if possible. We want to then also reduce and do this through innovative designs, and we also want to mitigate potential risks by having clear documentation for this. We also know that we have a history of documentation that underlies the concepts of the surface, the microthreads that you heard earlier from Bjorn, the conical seal, the 11-degree internal conical seal, and the connective tissue contour, the architecture that is from the head of the implant up to restorative margin, which sculpts that magical soft tissue, which creates the illusion of a tooth emerging through the tissue. So the challenges first is this concept of primary stability. And I'm going to run two sides of this argument back and forth with you today. The first thing is when we think about primary stability, and I want you all to remember, bone is not wood. It is not a dead tissue. The only dead bone is the stuff that my surgeon sometimes takes from a cadaver, or is a person who just never made it out of the OR. Okay? But the reality is we don't want to disrespect bone in terms of its biological possibilities of being overstressed. So we do this primary stability to make ourselves feel good about the implant outcomes. We do this through the surgical technique. We do it through an enhanced implant design for stress distribution. We do this through loading conditions that, and I'm talking here about occlusion, where we are trying to reduce the amount of micromotion by about 150 micrometers or less. But we need to take into account at the same time the bone biology of the anatomy in that area, both its density and its quality. And so when we talk about this, our ultimate goal is not primary stability, it is secondary stability, because osseointegration is really secondary remodeling of that interface. And even implants, has been shown by Marco De Digi, is that even implants with very low ITV, if they are stabilized in his study with a welded framework, he could actually have all of those implants go on to integrate, even at very low ITV. We did a study that I wanted to talk about just for a second, where we looked at immediate loading in a randomized controlled trial with a range of different, in this particular case, insertion torque values. This was two sites. I had a colleague at Oregon and us at Iowa. we were looking at 80 subjects, in this case, looking at loading over 16 weeks with one implant, a 4.0. This was a TX implant loaded, in this case, and modeled with ITV. We randomized these patients to those that had very low ITV, less than 10, were defaulted to a 12-week loading group. Those between 11 and 20 Newton centimeters of insertion torque were either 6 or 12 week, and those that were 21 or greater were then randomized to either immediate provisionalization, 6 or 12 week. What we found in this particular study, which was actually quite fascinating, is we didn't get the dip with the osteospeed surface that you see with other implant systems when we're measuring, in this case, with the Ostel ISQ measurements. The other thing that Reva Berwal found in this particular study, let me go back, was the fact that our bone measurements were actually exactly what we expected to find, about 0.3 millimeters mesodistal bone loss, even though between immediate loaded all the way up to our normal 12-week loaded delayed standard healing period. And so what we found in this particular study was that, yes, with a randomized controlled trial, you could actually have significant outcomes in terms of stability as long as you are careful in terms of how you set up the occlusion. Now, as I made the comment earlier, primary stability is important, but secondary stability, osseointegration, in the end is what we're really trying to get at. And this is an example from a chapter that I wrote with a colleague of mine, Eugene Roberts at Indiana. And what we recognize is that if you put too much pressure on that surrounding bone, you're going to enhance the remodeling rate, and you're going to actually weaken that interface, at least during the initial period, especially around 3 weeks. So you want to be careful about this. So I talk about this perception of primary stability, and that is rotational resistance with this insertion torque. There's a suggestion that high peak insertion torque is desirable, anywhere between 25 to 45 Newton centimeters to reduce this micromotion, but above 45 Newton centimeters is indicated to be potentially detrimental. And part of this is the clinical complications of a fractured facial plate when the implant creates so much insertion torque that the bone gives way in terms of plastic deformation. And there's some suggestion in the literature that this could actually lead to delayed healing, excessively high. So we're dealing with this balancing act. Depending on the anatomic site you're at, do you want to play with extremely high insertion torque or a low insertion torque, or do you want something moderate in between? So there are different ways of classifying bone. One is by the quality, which relates to the mineral density, the microarchitecture, as well as the trabecular thickness and separation. Now, there are a variety of ways of measuring this. One is which is using a micro-CT in a research study. And in this particular case, with a micro-CT, we can actually look at a set of parameters that can actually define what is the bone quality and quantity, and then convert these into conceptual clinical parameters of architecture, density, bulk, and space. Each of these playing a role in the ability to define at least the kinds of stability that you're going to get early on. We know there's been a traditional bone classification that George Zarb and Leckham put out back in the mid-'80s. And in this particular case, what's interesting in this particular classification is when you go in and do a research study and look at 10 different parameters that can be measured in a micro-CT, it's interesting. George, as much as that diagnostic thing was written out on a piece of paper in a bar to try to figure out a figure for his textbook chapter, it is interesting that if you look at this, the Leckham and Zarb scale actually correlates with quite a few of the measures that we have for the quantitative measurement in terms of bone architecture using micro-CT. So it's interesting how we had that early on in the 80s, and we've been able to use that today. When we look at primary stability and insertion torque, primary stability as a predictor for initial stability during the remodeling period is known to be an important initial part. But stability depends on the anatomy, the design, and the surgical approach, as you heard from Barry earlier this morning. The goal is to have sufficient stability, but not too much. Not too much where you cause the potential for pressure necrosis on the bone. So it's also important to remember, as Dr. Norton talked about in his publication, primary stability does not equal osseointegration. It equals stability, at least for that first 2 weeks or so. Secondary stability is what we're really trying to get at, and Michael actually argued that 25 Newton centimeters may be enough. So this led to this concept of thinking through what is the architecture from a clinical perspective for implant placement with the new EV system. And this came out with this idea of respecting the thickness of the cortical plate and then working with the kind of trabeculation that you're going to get at that particular site. So respecting that through the process of the surgical phase for primary stability. In the end goal, it's not the idea of having excessive amount of primary stability. The end goal is the Goldilocks approach. You want just enough to have good stability so you convert to secondary osseointegration, but not so much that you compromise the wound healing of the site. So let's talk now for a second about my enjoyment, and that is the implant abutment junction itself. And what is that role in terms of the robustness of the system? As we think about this, the key is we have been working with the conical seal design and the biology that has provided with this system since the mid-'80s. So we don't want to lose that when we're looking at this new EV system. The other thing is we want to have desirable characteristics when we think about the implant abutment junction. Of course, we want it to be stable. There's nothing more annoying to have a crown that is a beautiful restoration, and the patient comes in 2 months later and it's loose. And it's loose because the screws come loose, and it's not higher up in the brain that's loose, it's in the implant. So in this particular case, we want minimal joint micromotion. We want the potential to have reduced microleakage around that particular abutment implant junction. Well, of course, we want minimal peri-implant inflammation, and we want a stable, simple index capability. As Dr. DeLynn talked about in the intro this morning, it was an era when we needed a double hexagon inside the implant, when all you had as an option was prefabricated abutments that the laboratory technician had to fit into the implant. With the advent of the CAD/CAM solutions now, you only need to have one position for that abutment, and you don't need to have the complication of all of the indices inside the implant. That also tends to strengthen the implant body itself by having less indices cut into it. The index system, therefore, is not altered by the implant driver. We have an enhanced abutment junction, which I'll talk about using dynamic testing, and it's still a retrievable system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the mechanics on this. The first is, what is the implant itself in terms of its robustness? There's a standardized ISO testing methodology, and to understand this, you need to understand the ISO specifies that the implant has to be the head of the implant has to be 3 millimeters outside of the bone substitute in the test. The test occurs at 30-degree angle because you're primarily testing the wall strength of the implant itself. In this particular case, what you're seeing here is the fatigue limit, and this particular piece of data here is showing with the TX 4.0 as the reference implant. And in this case, you can see with the EV 4.2, which is a thicker wall structure to this implant, you can see there's a 17% increase in the strength, the fatigue strength of the 4.2 relative to the 4.0 implant. When you look at the 3.5, the other aqua implant in the family, when you look at the 3.6, again, you can see that there's an increase in the implant fatigue strength of the implant body itself using the ISO standardized test methodology. The other thing you can look at in this particular case is where that fracture occurs. And this is actually standardized. In this particular test methodology, you test it at 5 million cycles, and then you run the implant total to fracture in the test. And so what you're looking at is, where does it fracture? Does it fracture at the base of the microthread to the macrothread? Does it fracture within the microthread portion itself? So you're actually looking at minimizing the fracture, in this particular case, by decreasing the number of microthreads, increasing the number of macrothreads, and moving the thickness of the implant right at the place where it could fracture in the previous clinical observations. The other thing then of looking at the implant mechanical properties, it's interesting. If you look at the reference implant, the standard TX 3.5, and you go with different abutment designs on the 3.6 implant, tie design, ZER design, temp design, cast design, or the direct abutment, you can see a progressive increase in terms of the fatigue limit, in terms of the bending properties relative to the 3.5 millimeter implant. You also see that the implant connection has changed. Now, to do this test, they had to redesign the test to isolate the implant abutment junction away from the implant body connection. And in this particular case, it's a 90-degree test to the implant abutment junction. And when you look at the 3.5 versus the 3.6, either a one-piece or a two-piece abutment, you can now see this implant abutment junction actually increases relative to the reference 3.5. If you look at the 4 millimeter, you can see with the EV 4.2, it jumps all the way up here to where you actually have almost a 40% increase in terms of the abutment implant robustness of that platform, going from the 4.0 to the 4.2. And so that actually took a new test methodology for them to develop this and to come out with this. So to summarize the mechanical testings here is that the test implant, in this particular case, the EV of different diameters and the control implants were connected to the two-piece abutments. And using a standardized ISO test methodology, they found the implant body itself was 11 to 20% superior in terms of its fatigue resistance. You saw this this figure earlier in this particular case with the TX as a reference of 1. You can actually see that relative to the 4.2, either straight or conical, the straight was actually enhanced by 17%. The conical is slightly different because 4.2 actually drops now to a 3.6. So it's a smaller implant as a conical component. When we look at the implant abutment interface, again, using their new test methodology, the 90-degree to isolate to the implant abutment junction, they actually see with the fatigue strengths demonstrated, again, improved mechanical strength with the EV platform relative to the TX. When you look at the mechanical test parameters, you can again see, in this case with the EV, the screw itself, or the integrated direct abutment, again, you see the increased robustness with the new EV platform relative to its neighbor, in this particular case, the OsseoSpeed TX 4.0. The other component to this particular case is the uni abutment, which you heard about earlier, which is now a 33-degree uni abutment, a more robust. And what's interesting here is relative to the 20-degree uni abutment, it also showed an enhanced superior integrated strength. In fact, 41% stronger relative to the 20-degree uni abutment in this particular case. And then the screws. Now, the interesting thing about this is the engineers came into this wanting to be able, they had a threshold of fatigue that they wanted to get at, and they wanted in the clinic that a restorative dentist just had to use one insertion torque for each screw. And to do this, they ended up coming up with a test design. If you look across the screws, each screw head is slightly different in design. And there's a specific reason for that, because their goal was preload resulting from one torque. So this is the goal that they were getting at in this particular case. And preload is a function of the design of the screw, the surface structure of the screw, the material the screw is made out of, and the lubricating action of the surface of the screw thread itself. In this particular case, they had a minimum of 250 newtons, which is the key threshold here, that screw had to get up to with 25 newtons of insertion torque. So the idea was, no matter what platform you're working with, you always use 25 newton centimeters on the abutment screw, and you will achieve at least 250 newtons of preload onto that screw. So it simplifies that particular thing of what to remember in the clinic of what screw in this particular case, torque that you need to use. It's always 25 newton centimeters. And the last part they ask about is, do these things leak? And in this particular case, using a pressure test on the implant abutment junction, they actually found that they did not detect leakage through the implant abutment junction, in this particular case, using a fluid leaking test. So that was all kind of nice. To summarize then, in this particular case, the implant body is 17% stronger relative to the reference 4.0. The EV 4.2 abutment is 47% stronger than its preceding 4.0 TX. The EV uni abutment is 41% stronger. It's a robust abutment if you've played with this. I mean, it is quite a bit bigger. And the prosthetic connecting screw is more robust, which we'll talk about here in a second. The conical seal design has stayed the same, again, with no micro leakage, and it's a flexible drilling protocol, which you heard about earlier from Dr. Levin. So, from my perspective, staring down inside this puppy, you now have 7 slots. You don't have the indices, you have slots. And in this particular case, it all fits with the different abutment designs. The CAD-CAM abutments, which we'll talk about from Atlantis, the prefabricated abutments for those that want to use them, and then you can see with the icons that are used here with the direct abutment, it shows that it doesn't need to engage the indices or the slats at all. When you look at a cutaway, you can see that the key here is your biomechanical strength of the 11-degree conical seal, and you're not, even though you have this ledge in here, you are not bottoming out on that ledge. Biomechanically, you're engaging the conical seal itself as the most robust part of the implant abutment junction. The other thing, of course, and this is my favorite saying, is in fact, you have 6 slots for prefabricated abutments and the unique 7th slot for Atlantis. Or in other words, new math, 6 plus 1 is more than 7, which is really the Atlantis advantage for your referring dentists who really want to be able to have this as a simplified pathway to success. You've heard earlier about the self-alignment of the impression coping, and that's a little bit counterintuitive at first if you're not used to it, because I'm used to grabbing the body of the impression coping, torquing it down, and then tightening down the abutment screw. Now you actually bring this in with the screw, abutment screw itself, and you twist it, and in fact, the impression coping self-aligns and finds the unique 7th slot inside the implant. Okay, I'm going to talk now a little bit about the clinical trial that we've been involved with the documentation. This is what's referred to as a non-inferiority clinical trial that was randomized. What that means is that we are looking for the TX versus the EV, do they perform similarly in terms of the outcome measures in the study? There are 5 centers in this study, myself at Iowa, which is the lead institution, Hugo de Bruyne in Belgium, Dennis Cicanato in Italy, Christoph Lauer in Frankfurt, and Nurit Bittner in Columbia in the US. The study design was to recruit 120 partially edentulous subjects, either upper or lower jaw, equally randomized between the EV system or the OsseoSpeed TX, 60 subjects per group with using a 1-stage surgical protocol, early loading in 6 to 8 weeks after implant placement, with a cement retained restoration. For this study, the only abutment that was available at the time was the tie design cemented abutment. We are following the study for 5 years. In this particular case, it is important, as I show you some of this data, this was before the color coding was put into place. This was the very first off the, if you will, factory as these implants were just finishing their mechanical tests. So these were not color coded in this particular prototype study. We started in this particular case where we were using the new drills and a few of the implant designs. Not all the implant designs were available at the time we started the study, and as I said, we were limited to just the tie design cement retained platform. The advantage to this, we found many issues early on in this, even before the first step ambassador, which we were able to feed back information to the engineers so that, in fact, when the products moved along in the developmental process, we were able to give really good information right up front to avoid any problems and resolve these before the further clinical field evaluations, which was the ambassador studies. Our primary outcome measure in this is marginal bone height between the EV and the TX, with a series of different secondary measures. In this particular case, implant survival, insertion torque, perception of stability, condition of the implant mucosa, plaque, and of course the safety. The products that we were allowed to use in the study was the 3.6, 4.2, and 4.8 relative to the 3.5, 4.0, and the 5.0S. In terms of the study itself, in this case with the EV, we had 59 subjects, 79 implants. And what we have followed so far in this data set, we are actually through 1 year, and I'll show you 1 year data. We are following 54 subjects with 72 implants. We did have a few failures in the EV, and that was actually part of the learning curve. We actually found that these implants have so high primary stability that some of the first implants went in. We actually got the implants in, and then we found that they were 2 millimeters short of going to the full length of the osteotomy. We didn't realize just how robust this primary stability was in terms of what was designed into the system. In terms of the TX, in this case, we have 58 subjects, 81 implants that have actually gone to 1 year now in terms of the data. Implant positions, what was interesting in our study is you can see here, most of the implant sites were in the premolar and molar sites. So if you think about primary stability, where are the challenges? The challenges are usually in the upper jaw in the premolar and molar site. In the TX, it was also the same. You can see in this particular case, mostly posterior aspect of the mouth that had been recruited for this particular study. We also found, and I'm reporting here, is manual seating. What manual seating means is that the surgeon got the implant in this case it went up to 45 Newton centimeters, and in fact what they found was that in this particular case, in the upper jaw, they actually had to hand ratchet the implants in this case because they bottomed out at 45. So this started thinking through, well, maybe primary stability here is almost too much, and we need to augment and allow our surgeons other flexibility, and along came the V and X drill, which I'll talk about here in a clinical case. In the TX, as you can see, there were fewer implants that had to be hand ratcheted when they maxed out at 35 Newton centimeters, which was in the protocol with the TX implant. We use the insertion torque. For those who aren't familiar with this, it's a force feedback device within the handpiece, and it gives you a measure of the insertion torque as the implant is going in terms of its rotational stability. We then looked at ITV between EV and TX, and I'm going to point you to the median, which is actually a better measure than the mean. For those that don't remember basic statistics, median is 50% is above and 50% is below. It's a better measure than having a mean where you could have one skewed student move the whole class average up. You don't want that, okay? So if we look at the median in the maxilla, 24 Newton centimeters. Look at the mandible, 45 as a median with a range of 5 to 45, versus the TX, which was 20 to 23, which is statistically no difference. So you can see if you look at the median itself in ITV in this early clinical, in the first clinical trials where we were doing this, you could see a significant jump in this particular case of the insertion torque values that was measured at placement. Surgeon's perception was also measured. Now it's impossible to mask the surgeon, so you take this with a grain of salt in terms of what was reported in this particular case. We asked, was the implant guided into the prepared osteotomy? In this particular case, you can see that they rated the TX a little bit less than the EV. The EV seemed to perform better in terms of following its way into the osteotomy. When we looked at this, as you can see it again here, that it was reported there that it followed it correctly, and that the perception of primary stability from the surgeon's perspective was enhanced in this particular case between the use of the stepped drills, the undersized osteotomy, and the implant shapes, which are used to actually act, if you will, as an osteotome for improving stability of the implant. The primary outcome measure was bone loss, and in this particular case, what we are looking at is mean marginal bone loss from implant placement. I'm not going to report from prosthetic because, in my opinion, I'm more interested in what's the bone loss as a part of the healing process from the day my surgeon has placed the implants. In this particular case, EV versus TX. And again, I'm going to point you to the median, which is the 50% point. And you notice here at 8 weeks, 6 months, and 1 year, median at 1 year is basically 1/10 of a millimeter radiographically mesial and distal in this particular case. You can see the min, and I'll talk about this, the worst case was about 2.75, and we actually had a net gain radiographically of 2.5 with the EV. When you compare it against the TX, the reference implant, remember, this is a non-inferiority study. We're not interested, we didn't go into the study wanting to show superiority. It's a different clinical trial design. We were asking, does the reference implant, which is TX, does the new test implant perform equally, at least with a measure of radiographic bone loss on the mesolar distal aspect? So in this case, again, at 1 year, 2.7 millimeters of bone loss on one implant, and the maximum was a net gain of 4. So in fact, when you look at this in the most accurate way, which is looking at how all the implants did in the clinical trial, you can see coming from here all the way up here where most of them actually were right around no bone loss that was measured from implant placement in this particular case. There were some that gained in this particular case. There were some that lost. But what I want you to appreciate is the fact that the reference implant, the TX implant, and the new EV implant in a non-inferiority design perform the same by this particular measure. So what we come to expect historically from the TX implant, the new EV implant is doing the same, even though it went in with higher primary stability. The bone loss from restorative stays about the same in this case. Now the problem with the restoration is this is taking place at a variable period of time, 6 to 8 weeks after the implant placement itself. But again, we're seeing the same pattern here of most of the bone loss staying right around 0, which is what you would hope to see in terms of the stability of the site. So let's talk about some clinical examples. In this particular case, this is my patient number 1 in the mandible that was missing her molars in this particular case. We went in this particular case, nice robust bone, at least 2-dimensionally. We went into a 3-dimensional measurement in this particular case. To do this today, I would probably go into Implant 16, and hopefully the library will be available soon within Implant 16 for EV. What we did here is we did this with the screen captures that I'm showing you here, figuring out what kind of length that we could have for implant placement, and placing, in this particular case, the new EV implants in this 2 on both sides, and then using the impression copings for an implant level impression. Now, this is from the early, before it was color-coded. What you have now is each of them are color-coded based on the diameter that comes. Now, what's important for a referral, for those of the surgeons in here, you gotta remember that for your referral base, they're used to a platform that would be aqua or lilac. Now what they need to do is know, is it purple, gold, blue, or brown? They don't need to know the diameters, but they do need to know that all the parts are color-coded because they don't intermix. It's a unique platform, and that's how they gain the mechanical advantage. And that's why the color coding was important. You'll also notice on the bottom here is there's a set of slots to pick up the unique position of that 7th slot for the implant itself. As you can see here, you use your finger to screw in the impression coping. You don't grab the shaft. As you turn it, it will actually self-align and find the unique 7th position that's needed for the CAD/CAM Atlantis abutment in this particular case. You then go in and you give it a nice little tightening, and in this particular case, making sure that's nice and tight. This particular component can also be customized if you have gone through the trouble to go through an implant level provisional and you want to capture that and convey that information into the CAD/CAM environment. As is showing here, just coming in, these are actually titanium rather than steel. So they're a little bit softer in terms of the material. These little grooves that have been cut in here actually are, I find them actually really useful. If my gloves get really wet, they don't slip in my gloves as well because they tend to engage and you're able to hold them better. The other thing, of course, is you have now color-coded prosthetic screws. Now, in this particular case, as you can see with the 4.8 and the 5.4, you'll notice it's a 2mm screw, and that it's a 1.6 or a 1.8 millimeter screw on the smaller. But again, you're all getting above 250 newtons of preload from the same torque, which is 25 newton centimeters. There's also a laboratory screw which has it has a pointed end on it. What's nice about the laboratory screw is it cannot fit into the implant. So the lab has a screw unique to them that fits into the implant analog on the mastercast, but it doesn't fit into the real implant, so that the clinical screw that you get should be a pristine screw that has not been played with in the lab. In this particular case, just porcelain fused to metal crowns, pretty straightforward type of outcome for my first experience with the EV system. Now, there are other applications where I have found EV to be of strategic value. One is in the management of the Edentulous patient in this particular case. Nice looking dentures that she had when she first presented. And in this particular case, we went through a standard diagnostic setup, in this case using a foil on this. She's part of one of my studies where I'm looking at bone remodeling that's occurring on the residual ridge underneath complete denture prosthesis that are connected to, in this case, conus abutments. So what we're doing in this particular study is we're able to map the three-dimensional contour of the bone underneath using a foil that's been laid on the integular surface of the denture. So we're able to come in here with a CT scan, and you can see from here is we're able to actually map the bone relative to the denture base itself, and we're tracking this longitudinally over time in this particular study. And this is just showing another screenshot over here where we can actually map the changes of bone underneath the edentulous, in this case, integular surface of the complete denture. She was actually treatment planned for 3.6 implants in this particular case in the edentulous anterior mandible. Dense Lecco-Manzarb type 1 bone. Here was an instance where my periodontist who was placing the implants they were placing the implants in and then they would bottom out. The bone was so dense, the primary stability was so tight that in fact he had to back the implants back out and use the optional X drill. And what the X drill is it basically opens up the osteotomy so that in fact for a traditional AstroTech user, the implant goes in and it doesn't have a huge undersized osteotomy. It's only about 1/10 of a millimeter undersized osteotomy. So it's going to feel like a traditional AstroTech TX implant if that's what the surgeon wants for that particular site. So you have that option of this quote-unquote X drill. What's interesting here is we had 4, and we were looking at now a conus solution for this edentulous patient. My periodontist, had implants in a couple of little different directions, but it doesn't matter in this particular case because making the implant level impression, verifying that, and then coming in here, combining Atlantis conus with a syn cone, being able to use a 5-degree taper on these, and then being able to self-correct, I was able to go to my complete denture and have this confident, as long as I had a confident master cast that was an accurate representation, I could go from the abutments right to completion of the denture so that I'm able to go in with a removable prosthesis, as you can hear about from our last speaker this morning, with other options, with the ability to merge Atlantis conus solutions with a type of solution that is straightforward, allows multiple systems, in this case, non-parallel doesn't really matter. And I argue this is actually probably a pretty good place for tilted implants that can be self-corrected in the Atlantis CAD/CAM environment. It is currently recommended only for a removable option in this particular case, but it allows, especially in a geriatric population, which you'll hear about later this morning, that it's easy for them to keep this clean in this case, and it is economical, which is important in today's world. So as you can see here, she's able to have this denture which doesn't snap to place, but it slides to place and engages on the 5-degree taper in this particular case of these conus abutments for the removable option. So the simplicity for EV for me is, remember, each of these fits only one way into that implant. So in fact, as long as I know my master cast is an accurate transfer, there's no transfer index that's needed, and in fact I was able to go to process of my denture in this particular case knowing that the abutments are going to fit at the same day that I deliver the complete denture. There are other applications. This is a colleague of mine, it's actually a friend of mine, who ended up losing number 7 in this particular case. It fractured off, and my periodontist and I had a discussion. We decided to go forward in this particular case using a EV implant in this particular case. Following the same rules as Lyndon has talked about in terms of the 3-2 rule, we tried to position the implant within the extraction socket, which is where we've seen the greatest value of what EV can do for us, is immediate placement. And going forward in this case, where we're using one of those 2-piece triangular healing abutments in this particular case, coming in, and in this case with a gold hue abutment on the 3.6 implant, and then obturating, if you will, the access hole once the 25 Newton centimeters is placed, and then coming in this case with a zirconia crown on top. So it's a simple solution for what was a fractured, endodontically treated tooth, and it was, on a personal friend, I wanted to make sure that we actually had expedited therapy, and we were able to do this in the extraction socket. There are other places. In this case, this lady had a 3-unit fixed partial denture that was a zirconia fixed partial denture. And even if it's all ceramic, she still got, of course, recurrent decay. So we sectioned this off. And Dr. Avila, who is one of my periodontists, went in this case, placed an EV implant on the palatal aspect, and then placed another EV next to it, in this particular case, grafted. And then I came back in using a gold hue. Now, the difference between zirconia and gold hue, titanium, the titanium engages in 5 slots, and the zirconia engages in 3 slots. But they both fit one way into the implant analog. So it's a straightforward process of the 2 gold hue abutments, and then 2, in this case, zirconia crowns. A real simple solution to convert from a failing 3-unit fixed partial denture to individual teeth for her. There's another application in this case in an older gentleman where we ended up having this endodontically treated tooth here in the premolar and the maxillary left side, a fractured canine in this particular case here. And we then, in this case, decided, again with Dr. Avila's help, is we use the V drill in this case. What the V drill allows my periodontist to do is, as he gets close here to the edge of the maxillary sinus, rather than having the implant prematurely bottom out, he can just poke right at the end of the osteotomy so that the implant can go completely to length, and he's not fearing that he's hitting the hard anterior piriform rim of the maxillary sinus. So it's giving, again, surgical flexibility that you've always had with the traditional TX system, but it allows you as a surgeon to have the knowledge of what the anatomy is of what you want to gain. And you have that here with this particular outcome. What I used with this gentleman was the 33-degree EV uni abutment. And there's only the 33, and that allows two of these to be 66 degrees off axis in this particular case. And it has this robust 1.8 millimeter prosthetic screw in this particular case. So the way this is used is this is different than the old uni abutment. In this particular case, can you click on that? In this particular case, you'll see that there's a uni driver that snaps into place, and that's what allows you to retrieve this. And they come sterile in this particular case, so that they screw in this particular case, placed in with 25 Newton centimeters. And you'll notice that for those traditional Astrotech users, the little grooves, the 4 little grooves are now gone from the uni abutment. And that's because that uni driver, if you need to retrieve this, fits right back into the top, and you can unscrew this if you so choose that that was not the length that you want. I personally, when I use the uni abutment, I always use the shortest uni abutment, and it's the only one I use. And then I sculpt the tissue from there, depending on the prosthesis that I'm using. In this particular case, it is important for the folks that are not used to the system, is you'll notice it's uni abutment EV 4.8. And that means it's for the 4.8. There's an EV uni abutment that's different for the 3.6, for the 4.2, for the 4.8, and the 5.4. So you need to make sure that you know in the referral basis what is the correct parts that are needed at the time of the restorative aspects of the case. In this particular case, I'm also going to admit that I'm 54 years old. I actually, rather than the uni driver, I actually like using the impression coping that I will screw into the abutment and pop it out and then deliver it to the site with the impression coping. And then the impression coping and the uni abutment are already connected. I'm ready to go forward with my final impression. That's my own personal preference versus using the uni driver, but it is an option. Okay, in this particular case, doing a cantilevered ponic, a premolar size, and you'll notice in this case I've got the 33-degree uni abutment present here. And if you look at the mechanics here, is that I've got the cutaway, I've got my implant, I've got the abutment that's seated. It's not on the flat shoulder. It's making use of the traditional 11-degree conical seal, and it has this robust prosthetic screw, probably the largest prosthetic screw around on the market. It's this 1.8 millimeter screw that is connected, and it stays really nice and tight in this particular case. So with this, I kind of walked you through Darwin's observations. I kind of walked you through the story early on about Darwin getting pretty much scooped in terms of the theory of evolution. If you know the story, he actually did get scooped, and then it came back, and he had really good friends in the Royal Society, and the Royal Society that got him published first and held back the other guy's publication. So there, science is always a bit of politics as well as science. So as we talk about this, I want you to consider for a moment what you've heard this morning. You've gone through a set of systems now where all of the aspects that you're used to seeing with the Astrotech system are still present, but they've just been enhanced. You have the OsseoSpeed surface, which is still present and still has all of the attributes for the last now 11 years that's been on the market for accelerated bone healing. You have now this unique new ability where that impression coping goes in one way and picks up the unique 7th slot for an Atlantis CAD/CAM solution. You have the same zirconia abutments that are present with the connective tissue contour, and in fact, that's actually been tweaked even on the Atlantis side in terms of improving that. You have the strong interface, and you have that flexibility of using a 6-pointed prefabricated from this, or the unique position for Atlantis. 3 for the zirconia, and 5 that are picked up with the titanium. All with the ability of keeping the bone that we've always seen as I showed you in the clinical trial, which is what we've always grown to expect. And that's what we want, is minimum bone loss so we don't have recession. And so we always have stability of our outcomes. And this is really a product of evolution over time. And that is what I call science, the ability for a company, in this particular case, to ask the difficult question and bring in clinical investigators to actually help them in the thought process and evaluate and be willing to value and trust the comments from the community, the clinical community, to be able to know in the end, what is it we want? We want the very best for our patients. And this is all part of the evolution, in this case, through to the EV system. So I want to thank you very much for your kind attention with being with me this morning. It's been a great pleasure for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clark. That was absolutely fabulous.